Tanche, bonsoir, and good evening. Welcome to the launch of Safer Schools Without Policing Indigenous and Black Lives by author Fadi Ennab in partnership with Police-Free Schools Winnipeg. I'm André Forest. I'm the project coordinator with the Manitoba Research Alliance at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. The Manitoba Research Alliance is a community academic partnership, and the research launching this evening is funded by a grant of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. The MRA and CCPA have been doing research that tackles wicked problems, helping to push the policy agenda in Manitoba and beyond, and helping to support researchers, students, and community organizations to do the same. While we meet on a virtual platform, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the land on which we organize and on which I'm situated. I recognize the Indigenous nations who have been stewards here on Treaty 1 since time immemorial, the Anishinaabe, Innu, Oji-Cree, Dene, and Dakota. It is also the birthplace of the Métis, which is my nation. The water we drink is from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation, and the hydroelectricity powering our systems is from Northern Manitoba, Treaty 5. Beyond recognizing land and water, I want to acknowledge the incredible and challenging work by scholars, activists, and community members, many of you here, no doubt, who have been fighting for solutions to problems caused by ongoing colonial policies in Canada, especially those from which many still benefit at the expense of others. I trust that the research presented here tonight will continue in this process. While we're not all in the same place, I invite you to recognize where you are and who protects the water and the lands around you and continues that important advocacy work. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. So the program this evening includes a presentation by author Fadi Ennab, a short film that accompanies the report, words from Irene Bindi, a parent member of Police-Free Schools Winnipeg, followed by a Q&A session. So as many of you may be familiar with now after a couple of years of online events, the Q&A function of the webinar is what we'll be using for questions. So please submit them there whenever you have them. You don't need to wait until the kind of last section to submit them. Feel free to let us know if you have any issues. Both myself and Dagan Parrott, who's helping in the back end, can try to sort out any issues you might be having. So feel free to send us a message through the chat. So I'll hand off Fadi's introduction to Elizabeth Comack, one of the co-stream leads for the Justice, Safety, and Security stream of research at the Manitoba Research Alliance, and Professor Emerita of Sociology and Criminology at the University of Manitoba. So over to you, Elizabeth.
Thanks, Andre, and good evening, everyone. As Andre mentioned, the research report being launched this evening is part of a much larger project that's being undertaken by the Manitoba Research Alliance. The MRA was formed almost 2 decades ago, and over that time we've been engaged in research that tackles what Andre's referred to as wicked problems, especially in relation to the racialized poverty and social exclusion that's experienced by Indigenous and inner city communities. I'd like to think that we're also doing wicked research, research that not only exposes those problems, but offers meaningful ways of resolving them. We've organized our work into 4 main streams: justice, safety, and security, housing, education, employment, and social inclusion, and community economic development. And I've been co-leading the justice stream with Amelia Curran, who's in the Criminal Justice Department at the University of Winnipeg. We're really delighted to be working with Fadi Ennab. I first came to know Fadi actually over 10 years ago, I think, when he was a master's student in the Department of Sociology and Criminology at the University of Manitoba. Fadi focused his MA work on the colonial history of policing. His MA thesis was titled "Rupturing the Myth of the Peaceful Western Canadian Frontier, a socio-historical study of colonization, violence in the Northwest Mounted Police from 1873 to 1905. Since that time, he's gone on to do important work as a community researcher and advocate, focusing on issues related to anti-racism, policing, and migration, including a CCPA report that he authored on refugee parents' involvement in their children's education. Most recently, Fadi's been continuing his academic studies. He's pursuing a PhD as a Vanier Scholar in the Faculty of Education at the U of M. Now, one of the issues that we're focusing on in the justice stream is how criminal justice system responses can actually exacerbate rather than resolve social inequalities, particularly in relation to reproducing systemic racism. Fadi's work on the use of police in schools sheds an important light on that issue. And so I'm really pleased to be here with you tonight as he launches his report. So over to you, Fadi.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth and Andre, and everyone in attendance. Let me share my screen. So first, I want to tell you, I guess, about the research that currently exists on police in school. The evidence show that racialized and marginalized people, communities often are intimidated and are criminalized by police in school. And research show that police often do not and cannot prevent crime, but in case often leads to more violence. For similar reasons, we have school boards across this continent that ended or suspended the school resource officer programs in their schools. This research is not new, and what I'm going to share is not unique to Winnipeg. Writing in 2003, that's 20 years ago, Angela Davis warned us that the danger of having police in our schools. And if we keep having police in school and don't address those structural changes, the schools are going to remain a major conduits of prisons. So we shouldn't be surprised to hear stories, often in the media, about kids being arrested in school. In this case, it's a 6-year-old from Ontario. A temper tantrum becomes a criminal issue when we bring in the police. And so the mere presence of police strikes fear and criminalizes students. The Winnipeg Police and the school divisions often refer to police in school as school resource officers. And I want to refrain from using this term so that I don't normalize its violence and its misuses. So I strongly encourage everyone to call them for what they are. They're police in school. And we shouldn't reuse the term resource of referring to them because it contradicts the research that exists. They're harmful and it's a misnomer and they're not a resource. And so we really need to be clear about those issues. Even if we're thinking about one individual officer, I'd use the spider metaphor that one officer is connected to a network of officers, network of institutions, and often they also recreate the harm. So we need to be mindful of what we're talking about. And this is what existing evidence shows us. The targeting of Indigenous communities are not new. It's ongoing, and it's not limited to the school. The very foundation of Western Canada is built on stolen land, labor, and resources, and facilitated by police. My thesis was mentioned earlier, so I'm just going to say one thing that I learned through this is that the history of policing has been racist and continues to be one. My thesis focused on this aspect of history, and I was able to see how you can't separate colonization and racism from the role of policing. And we can't ignore this history because you're complicit in colonization. Today in Manitoba, while some school boards cancel their school resource officer programs, we don't have discussions about it. It's often silenced. We don't talk about racism as much, and it's not explicitly acknowledged. And we also see information that shows that Indigenous students in the Winnipeg School Division are overly represented in suspension rates. And I also know from personal experience doing the Louis Riel School Division review that police cause harm in schools. And so what I'm sharing with you is not necessarily out of the ordinary, except if you live an isolated life and you don't interact with racialized community and you have a different conception of safety, which I'll be addressing. So that gives you a background of policing, racism in schools. And now I can talk about my current study. When talking about police and racism in school, it's important to use an equity-based approach that centers the experiences of Indigenous and Black families, because they're disproportionately targeted by the criminal justice system. The system is not broken, it's not an accident, but they're an intended target of criminalization that's legitimated by laws, policies, and police. So by focusing on those experiences and understanding that those experiences are influenced by things like class, power, privilege, property, we need to be mindful that we consider those experiences. But in this case, I'm focusing specifically on Indigenous and Black students for those reasons, and that's why equity is important. The goal of the research project was to look at the experiences of Indigenous and Black families in the North End, downtown areas, those living or going to school. Yeah, that was the focus of our area. And the main focus was to see how do they feel and what those experiences are, and how can we make schools safer. In total, I had 24 youth and 13 parents and 2 key informants that I've interviewed for this research study. My main theme is that racism is a common experience for those families, and often they experience it without accountability. And in cases, sometimes, for example, students listed things like their hair being cut. One student mentioned that her hair was cut without consent, just walking down the hallway. In another cases, a student would mention her hijab has been ripped off multiple times. So you can tell from those cases the racialized and gendered aspect of those assaults. And it's not just overt cases like this, but there's often microaggressions. And not sitting next to certain students, bullying them, taunting them about their name, those racial harassments. And it's more problematic is that even when the parent was going to advocate for their own kid who was being bullied or harassed at school, the parent encountered harassment by peers in the school system and the staff. So there's levels of racism, and we need to be vigilant on those different forms of racism that I'll be addressing. The racism also involves staff. Some staff use things like the N-word very loosely, or taught about history and society in a way that excludes Indigenous or Black experiences, and often a very demeaning and decontextualized ways. And so, at times too, when there was no overt cases with staff, even when a student experienced racism, sometimes staff might witness that and be a bystander. And sometimes when students reacted back, lashing out to the racism they experience, they're being labeled by the staff as being racist. So it's not surprising that if you are like some of those Indigenous parents I interviewed, they express hypervigilance, especially if you're familiar with the history and continuous legacy of the residential school system. And then you have your children and grandchildren experiencing racism in the school, compounded by involving the police. So it was an intergenerational experience of racism that we need to be mindful here. For many racialized families, an individual school police officer was often something to be feared, concerned, not a source of trust. Far from that. Especially if you had negative experiences with them or your family or your friends, having family being arrested or beaten up, but also doing day-to-day things in the community. If a kid goes on a bicycle from school to home or home to school and gets arrested, gets stopped on the street because they were suspected of being a criminal. Kids get fearful just riding the bicycle. And then that echoes with you back to the school setting when you see a police officer. So that awareness of systemic racism influenced how you see a police officer, regardless of their actions and intent. Several participants shared stories that's disturbing and experienced where they experienced or witnessed instances where a school police officer arrested other students or involved in a disciplinary process. And often in these cases, the autonomy and safety of the student was compromised by the staff, school staff, and the police. Research point out that this is a school to prison pipeline. Having police in schools promote more criminalization of students for minor misdemeanor. We stop investing in the talking part. We just punish. And here's an example. Someone, for example, might bring a weapon to school. Now, a weapon is harmful, and it shouldn't be, perhaps, arguably, be in a school setting. And if that was the case, then you shouldn't have police officer with weapons. But back to the incidents where there's a case where a student gets a weapon in a bag, let's say, and then they're criminalized as a result of the process. But when you sit and talk to them and you understand, it's like, and perhaps the rationale is, I carry a weapon because I'm fearful when I go home. And so let's make that safe environment so that then they stop getting the weapon instead of being treated as a suspect. But there's many things. Sometimes it could be using a cell phone or any other incidents. Research shows that minor issues become a big deal when it's involving the police. It's escalating. Participants also shared instances where school staff was used, usually by administrators, where police was used against racialized students and families as a way of controlling and punishing their behavior. I'm just sharing one example here of a parent where they describe the police being used as a fear tactic. And now we're talking about staff having racial biases and racism that influences their decision to choose to call on the police. This is something that's common in settler colonies outside of the school walls. You could experience this in your neighborhood. Some people call on racialized communities more often and frequently, demanding a police response instead of other caring relations. Several participants noted that as a result of those experiences, that their belonging and self-esteem was compromised, really disrupted their academic performance. Sometimes they dropped out of school temporarily or permanently. But consistent with what the Black scholars and others have shown, we should call it a push out. It's not a dropout. It's not an individual choice all the time to drop out of school. It's often a concerted effort from the school policies, school systems, action and inaction that pushes students out of the school setting. And that's why instead of giving resources, we're also creating more harm, which is really concerning. Targeting students and under-resourcing those communities. It's a disturbing logic. Since childhood, for a lot of us, through the media, TV, literature, the role of police is normalized in society. Research calls it propaganda, carceral humanism, white magic, where sound bites by pro-police voices are used repeatedly to promote the image that they're safe, positive, relationship-wise, and something that we need and normalize. This is myth. It's not based on facts, but and misrepresentation. So we need to be vigilant on this. So while some participants, because of all this institutional investment, saw that there is a role for police in the school system, even those participants still felt that there could be harm with involving the police because it depends on their skills, it depends on the race, it depends on their understanding of harm reduction. So there was always like a caveat. So it wasn't full acceptance by those families. And this narrative is often used over and over by some politicians, school administration to justify the role of policing. One key informant I interviewed said that it's often very visible that this program was pushed on the community and it was a form that it wasn't accessible for the community. It was often the benefit of the school administration, who felt justified to call and punish racialized students. Given those experiences, I have a few recommendations to make based on the research evidence and what the families had to say. The first recommendation is having no police programs, no police involvement in school. You get them out, you deprioritize relations with them. Most participants felt that safety is important for everybody. So if their safety is valued, then everyone's safety is valued, whether you're queer, disabled, white. If Indigenous and Black families are safe in the school system, everyone benefits. The second one is the defunding from the police and reinvesting in social supports, social safety networks. Those could be things like elders, counselors, but it could be practical things like a walking school bus, a neighborhood watch group. Those were seen as way more beneficial than having police involved in those instances. And those are not fringe experiences. It's very common in Manitoba and across the continent too. Wherever there's police, there is resistance. There's a growing movement in Winnipeg to show that the need for defunding and abolishing the Winnipeg Police Service. Justice for Black Lives Winnipeg's pledge got over 120,000 signatures in 2020. At the same time, we also had protesters in City Hall demanding abolishing the police. So we need to consider those opinions as representative of a bigger voice. So until we come to a new world where police is abolished, we can't just have commitments. We also need to have accountability measures. We need to have clear guidelines when there's instances that are deemed necessary to call the police to collect data and clear guidelines on how staff to avoid and what to do in those cases. And when it is done, that we have data to be able to assess and monitor the situation, to see how systemic racism impacts certain population. Our status quo of a colorblind approach and not sharing information with the community is not transparent and doesn't promote accountability. Many participants in this research study felt also that we need things like representation. Representation is so important to see yourself for the kid and for the parent, to see yourself in the decision-making, to see yourself across the school system. As one parent put it when they met a principal, a vice principal, and a teacher, so 3 people, in their own words, the parent was saying that you have white, whiter, and whitest, all looking at each other and saying, this is okay, that my kid was punished through involving police, through the racism that they experienced, and agreeing with themselves. So yeah, if you often have a white system involving the police to discipline a colored system, you're going to keep having systemic racism. Anti-racism training was also seen as an important for staff. So anti-racist and representation in staffing. I hope this research urges our politicians and school administration to not just commit, but to act in anti-racist commitment, in decolonizing commitment, recognizing the treaty we're on. And if not, then I hope this research is used to push for systemic change and demand justice, and validate experiences and create spaces to have more important, meaningful discussions that have impact on our community. On this note, this brings me to an end. I just want to remind you, please, if you have a question, use our Q&A feature and write your question, and then we can get to it after we see the film and listen to Irene. I'm just going to stop my share now. It's important to look at the experiences of Indigenous and Black students in the North End and downtown area of Winnipeg Treaty 1 territory. We all know that those areas are heavily policed, and we know that there's structural disadvantages in the community that impacts the outcomes of and trajectory of those families. And so we're looking into those experiences to center those experiences and to think about safety from those experiences. And when you do that, you realize that some superficial notions of safety often silence marginalized families of color. Students already experience the school as a racist space often, and having police involved further make racism more entrenched in their relations. Our findings show that police involvement in school unjustly target racialized youth, breaches their rights for privacy and safety, and criminalizes their behaviors.
Students were bullying me because of my name and comparing it to a terrorist, and I didn't really like that. The more that it went on, the angrier I got, and so I got angry and it started showing in different ways. I noticed that when the students would make fun of me, nothing was done. I think when I first started getting angry, being in the hallway, I'd noticed longer looks from the police. It started gradually getting into the principal coming up and talking to me, and the police would be kind of by her side. And then after that, the police started talking to me. They would tell me to be careful. They would just make kind of remarks in the hallways. And then I just remember one morning I went to school. I was called into the office. I saw some of my belongings on a table. I guess they had searched my locker while I was in class, and they accused me of selling drugs. And then they did a strip search while I was in the office. The office was kind of visible, so there was like people in between classes, and I felt like I was being watched by like other students. I felt really uncomfortable, and I felt belittled.
My experience was that it just aggravated my son, and it made me feel like as a parent that I didn't have any power over anything. It just creates intimidation for students and for parents, and it just creates a whole new culture in the school, because then students are talking about that other student, and rumors get more inflamed, and that's been my experience with police in schools.
I'd come check in with the officer at least like once a week, and the officer would be by my class more often. But I think after that experience, I didn't go to school for much longer because I was suspended, and then I didn't really go back to school. For me, I came with a lot of baggage, being mixed race. I felt like my experience wasn't taken into account.
There really is no need to involve police, because these are students, and there is a lot of like emotional well-being that has to be taken care of with these students.
I think, for a long time I was really afraid to show my emotions, and I was really afraid to get angry. I think a lot of what happened with the police in schools, I think a lot of it followed me after, and so it created long-lasting effects on my psyche and how I guess interacted with the world.
Having a police presence just aggravates the situation. My experience with police as an Indigenous woman hasn't been positive. It says to me as a parent that teachers don't have good relationship with the students. No problem is so great that you can't resolve it with talking to the students and trying to figure out different ways of getting to the issues with students. Having police there is probably not the best idea, because it just creates a fear mentality.
But I think that experience followed me after, because sometimes I get like a lot of anxiety when I see police. It gets a little bit triggering.
A lot of these teachers don't have any experience outside of their school. The curriculum of teachers, there's no like anti-racist teaching, and there's no conflict management. And teachers really need to be trained like in cross-cultural awareness and emotional development, and yeah, it would be good to have like counselors there, and maybe elders, and even like peer support group of some sort happening.
Yeah, I'd recommend more diversity amongst staff. Something would be good as elders and giving students the tools for dealing with the emotions that they have. Ending police involvement, just like what police represent, sometimes it can feel a little bit overwhelming. You feel like you're a criminal before you've even done anything.
It can be very triggering having police presence, never mind being criminalized by them. It's humiliating in front of peers, and it takes an impact on the psyche of the individual, and it can be long-term and adds to that racism that they already experience and intensifies it. Most participants in the study felt that police involvement in schools should end. Families wanted to defund and deprioritize relations with the police, and it meant offering those genuine organic resources in the community and in the school. This could be in counselors, elders, social work, programs, having a safer spaces where the students feel they're heard, not judged. The racism permeates those relations in school. It's in the curriculum, it's with the students, it's with the staff, and adding police to that mix makes it really a toxic environment. And that's why it's really important to question policing of students. And even if though we ended police involvement in school, the policing logic can still be there in staff and in other peers. And so we need to be mindful of that and be vigilant against it. We need to be caring and respectful to others and understand the disadvantages that these communities feel. Most participants struggled with police in and outside of school. And so this wasn't just an issue of a few bad apples, but it was a system issues. When many students and families experience racism in school, they don't feel that there's accountability, and they feel that they're further hurt through going through the school process, which results in disengagement and pushing students out of schools. And so we really need to address those issues instead of further criminalizing those youth. Often when students are experiencing racism in school, they don't feel heard, and when they lash out, they're criminalized. And in the cases that we've showed, police really created more problems.
Thanks to Fadi and Ryan for developing that video and for the participants for lending their voices. I want to take the opportunity to introduce Irene Bindi, who is a parent representative of Police-Free Schools Winnipeg, which was a partner on the project. So go ahead, Irene, and just again, please feel free to submit your questions through the Q&A or through the chat if Q&A function is difficult, so we can get some answers. So go ahead, Irene.
Thank you, Andre. As just mentioned, my name is Irene Bindi, and I'm a parent member of Police-Free Schools Winnipeg. We are a grassroots group composed of parents, teachers, students, and other community members who want to see the end of all school resource officer, what's called school resource officer and school policing programs, and police in school involvement, as well as an end to the culture of policing in our education system that particularly targets Black and Indigenous and other racialized and marginalized students in numerous ways. We were really pleased to be asked by Fadi to be a community partner on this report. His findings echo the findings of similar reports in many other places, as he's mentioned. And importantly, it also echoes the voices of hundreds and now thousands of Black and Indigenous and racialized and marginalized students in Canada who have been coming forward and speaking publicly about these harms for years, even before the killing of George Floyd in 2020. To date, at least 18 school resource officer programs have been canceled, or, and they go by other names as well, but police in school programs or have been canceled or suspended across Canada. So the kind of information that's in this report has been out there for a long time, but suppressed or ignored by school divisions and media and government bodies. And we see this currently locally with Louisville School Division, who continue to refuse to release their report, which is equity research that's paid for by your tax dollars. And that report was directly resulted in the cancellation of that school division's SRO program. This report, although it reflects the same kind of information that is readily available in other contexts, is an important tool locally, partly because some school officials, city councilors, superintendents, and school board trustees still, with all the evidence of police harm out there, and even when it is presented to them directly, have said that this is something that happens elsewhere. This is a problem of Toronto or of the United States or other such diversional claims. And this report makes it a whole lot more difficult for them to make that kind of false claim. We are also, as most people listening in know, in the middle of a municipal election in Winnipeg, and the people that we elect to office make big decisions about the welfare of children and youth. The city provides half of the funding for SRO programs in Winnipeg, and the school divisions provide the other half. So we have developed a police-free schools pledge for all municipal candidates, city councilors, trustees, and mayoral candidates to end the remaining SRO programs and commit to the end of policing in schools. It's on our website and will be pinned to the top of our social media pages, but we'll paste a link to that Google Doc in the chat now here as well. So please help by sharing that with your candidates and asking them to sign and email their pledge into us. The fact is that the 94 calls to action demand that education honors treaty relationships and that it closes the resource gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous students. Access to education is a human right, and police are a proven obstruction to that right for racialized and marginalized students. I only have a few minutes, but I wanted to distill a couple of things before this event opens up to questions, because, well, it is hard for some people, for many people, in fact, to get their heads around this change, even though it shouldn't be with the information that we have before us. I just had the opportunity to hear some longtime police and prison abolitionists speak, and a few of them said things that have to do with unlearning that I think is relevant to this context and touches on some of the things that Fadi was speaking about in his report, words on his report just now. One of these abolitionists is Mariam Kaba, who said that for most of her life, she was pro-police because the thinking was that imagining an alternative was absurd. And it is and has been painted culturally to be perceived as absurd. And this is how entrenched and entwined the idea of public safety is with police, and the idea that police are the source of everyone's safety. She said that it is so hard for us to get beyond this idea because we are immersed in it from birth. She called it the water we drink and the air that we breathe. And she made the point that the vast majority of us have grown up in this way and in this context. So that's an important thing to always have in mind, as Fadi has just said. Second, Derica Purnell pointed out, and we hear this all the time, and we'll hear it, I'm sure, as part of the police and school division's responses to this report, this idea that police presence, the necessity about it is about relationship building or relationship repair. Derica Purnell said, please show me how this is a situation of repair by showing me the point in history, she said, where there was a trusting relationship between Black communities and police. It never existed. She said, sure, we trust the police. We trust them to be racist, violent, corrupt. I'm paraphrasing her list, but she had a long one. You know, she said, we trust them to lie, to monitor, harass, push Black people out of their homes and destroy communities. And parallel things can be said, of course, about, and have been said by Indigenous communities. So please, everyone who is listening, whether or not you've reached a point of, you know, understanding that reformist maneuvers, such as like using plainclothes officers, for example, are useless when policing and racism are inextricable. The fact is, these students' voices cannot be ignored. What these students are saying, that this police presence causes them a range of harms, cannot be ignored no matter where you are in your feelings about policing. So everyone, parents, and particularly white parents, it is important that you speak to, I think, at least 3 people, your school board trustee, your school principal, and your city councilor about this. This is very rooted, and it will not change without a lot of voices and a lot of pressure. And unfortunately, white voices have more power over administrations than any others, exactly because of the structural racism that is built into education. It requires comparably very little from you to help to create more healthy educational environments for all students. And tell those people that you want police involvement in your child's school removed, that you want other kinds of crisis supports in place, relationships with community groups, Indigenous elders, more counselors, better peer supports, etc. Those in senior administration in education need to be fighting for the same. And educators, when and how they can, often they are intimidated out of speaking up, teachers in particular. But everyone, of course, should be doing this and following up, because as I have experienced personally, you will find administrators in particular will tell you that they understand and that they empathize and even agree. They need to act though, and not just point to an equity policy. So please follow up as well after you speak with them. I had a reporter a couple of days ago ask me why I care about this issue. And to me, that is weird. And I was casting about and paused because they may as well, in my mind, have been asking, why do you care about the welfare of all children and youth, not just white, able, cis kids? And that is a bad question for obvious reasons, but it reveals something about the culture we're living in. So I'll stop there, but we are Police-Free Schools Winnipeg. We've grown since our inception and are always welcoming new members. So if you are interested in joining, please reach out. You can contact us through our website and also find there a number of resources. There's local testimonials there from students and teachers and parents about police harms, aside from what's in this report. That were gathered, that have been gathered since we started as an organization a couple of years ago, as well as the Police-Free Schools Municipal Pledge. So we'll put the link to our website as well in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Irene, for everything you shared, including really tangible actions that folks can take to push forward with the recommendations here. So thank you so much for being here, and we'll move along now to the Q&A. So fired up by Irene's recommendations and the very kind of what feels like a global experience of harms at the hands of police in schools. We'll go to some questions. So thanks to those. There's still time to submit your questions, so please do so. But we'll start with one. Fadi, you answered this one in the with the typing function, but I think it's worth asking again, in part because you've done a number of media interviews, and there always seems to be that the voice of police at the same time as that is also being interviewed. But there was a question about the police mentioning that the report was missing the perspectives of those who want the police in schools. So how would you respond to people who are asking that question?
It's a common response, very typical for the police across many spaces to deny accountability for harm when communities raise them. And so that's why we need to listen to the community, not to the police version of the story. Questioning the sample, questioning the research. You could also question the research and ethics that the police and pro-police voices use. It's often biased, it excludes Indigenous and Black experiences. So I would say it's even more crucial to highlight those experiences as I've done in the research. And especially that we're on Treaty 1 and that they're disproportionately impacted, and we have high poverty and colonization impact in those areas. So for many reasons, yeah, thank you.
Thanks. All right, so another question. Somebody says, I have recently been told that the removal of the SRO program has led to an increase in drug trafficking in local high schools. How would you respond to folks who support the inclusion of SROs in the belief that their presence reduces illegal activity in schools?
Right, and since the founding of Canada, we use the same excuse that we need police to curb on whiskey trade or curb on illegal activity or prostitution or whatnot. And so instead, like the presence of police increases criminal convictions. That should be more concerning than any illegal activity necessarily. Even if we're concerned about illegal activity, we need a harm reduction, not a zero tolerance approach. Policing promotes illegal activity because they take away resources and opportunities that students need. And on Treaty 1, police are illegal and should not be in school. So we need to identify what's illegal, and yeah, in that sense, decarceration, counseling, relational approach to students, if it's related to substance use or whatnot, we need educational messages. Yeah, talk to them as if they're children. but not. It's hard to relate sometimes to the kids if we don't feel them or relate to them, and we justify police that way. I hope that kind of addresses this.
Yeah, I think it speaks to the interrelation of a lot of these issues. So we have a few more questions for any school divisions that may also do a review of their Police in Schools program in the future. How important do you think it is to hire a third party with expertise in Indigenous and visible minority communities rather than doing the review themselves?
Right. So I'd always recommend having a third party approach than having a school system. But regardless of who's doing the review, sometimes, like, yes, the identity definitely is important of the individual researcher, but also what's the approach that you're adopting. So in my case, it's an equity approach, and then what's the survey tools or what techniques you're using, what questions you're asking. If you don't have a social justice lens and you're just concerned about commitment and pretending to listen, surveys exist already been used by the Winnipeg School Division that usually are quite biased in their asking. Doesn't show understanding of evidence-based research, to be honest. And so, and sometimes we need to realize the fact that what decolonizing research says in terms of those Indigenous communities are over-researched, and research is a dirty word. And so sometimes, quite frankly, we don't need reviews to know that it's a problem. But but if that's necessary to show the harms of policing, then having some transparency and accountability. It's not just enough to hire a third party, because that can also be compromised. So we need to be reflective about all those power relations involved. But for their own school system, having usually white people, privileged people, survey themselves, do their own tools with a white pro system, there's going to be a lot of biases because of systemic racism. So we really need to be vigilant. Yeah. So it's not a clear answer, but I think, Irene, you wanted to say something on the review. Yeah.
No, I just wanted to add to that from the perspective of Police-Free Schools organizing and the work that has already been done that's out there, and all of the students that have come forward and the parents of Black children who have organized and other racialized families. The attitude is that we, a review of any kind is at this point not necessary. There's a lot of resources and a lot of information out there. What needs to happen is the outright cancellation of these programs. And reviews, even third-party equity-based reviews still demand things of these students. And so it is, even when conducted in the best possible way, it is still a demand that these students shouldn't have to face, in addition to all of the things that they've already been going through.
Thanks, Irene. Yeah, that's a good note. And in particular, Fadi, what you were saying about, we'd probably need less research and more just acting on the many recommendations that we can find in a lot of different papers and reports through the years. So it's the action that's necessary. There's a question related to that. Is there a role for non-parents in voicing their concerns to school administrations?
There's a lot of ways for non-parents to voice their concerns. I know sometimes school admin might challenge a parent who's not involved in a school system to be involved that way, but there's different ways of people mobilizing and advocating. Irene, I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think it's important for people to understand that decisions that are made by the school divisions affect all of the residents of school divisions, not just parents or children who are enrolled in schools. So anyone can call their school board trustee and say, this is harming my community. We need this out. And definitely your city councillor. You should reach out and say, I don't want any kind of budget going to these programs, and demand the the defunding of the WPS's budget.
On that note, I thank you so much, Irene, for echoing that civic engagement and the need for mobilizing that way. And just to add that as a non-parent also, there's just not to rely on the police logic and the policing in itself. By reducing the ability of the police outside of school, we reduce its ability also inside the school system. So we just need to connect the dots sometimes. But yeah, there's other questions. I see lots.
Yeah, we'll go to maybe two kind of more technical questions related to the report. So one question was about, of the 24 students interviewed, were they from a variety of schools within the Winnipeg School Division? And then I'll just tack another one on. There was a list of recommendations in terms of alternatives, including elders, community workers, social workers, walking school bus, breakfast program, after school program, etc. Are there any others that you'd add to that list?
Okay, well, one of them was more fair than the other, to be honest, but I'll address both of them. From the 24 students that were interviewed, yes, they're from a variety of schools in the Winnipeg School Division. They're not all from one school or from one family. Yeah, there's a section in the report, demographics, that kind of touches on those issues. How I recruited them, where they came from, their age, gender, race. So yeah. The other questions that I felt it's not as fair because maybe the anonymous person wasn't fully listening or didn't fully read the report, but I'm happy to touch again on some of the other recommendations. Yes, we need counseling and those issues, as you pointed out, but we can't just stop on that measure of reform or social service. Like, there's a logic of policing. We shouldn't police and criminalize youth. We can still call the police on kids in school even after we cancel the program. So we need to have accountability measures. We need to have data. When those incidents happen, we need to track them so that we can monitor and evaluate those systems and assess the systemic racism in them. So it was no to police, have more resources like what you mentioned, but also those accountability measures. And there's things like anti-racism training, diverse staff. But in a nutshell, anything but police, even though that sounds reductive, but really it's not that hard to think of alternatives.
And especially those things working all together, right, to support folks. So given that there seems to be decades of evidence suggesting police in schools cause harm, why do you think there's still such a push to keep them there, and what and who are the forces pushing this as a solution?
Oh, always pushing me to learn more. I really appreciate that question. And it really shows the logic and the sick environment that we're in. Sorry even to use the word sick, because it just implies that it's an individual disorder that I feel it. But I think the research and the way I've been reading and thinking about this question is that there's a confluence of factors, whether it's capitalism, colonialism, that interact, that promotes having surplus of racialized communities that's worthy to be targeted, criminalized, and put in precarious situation to justify the continuous land theft, occupation, and violence. And so in that sense, it seems random, but it's a concerted effort on government side to implement those policies and target communities. So I think a lot of this have to do with having white politicians, white school admin, privileged, unexperienced in the community, making decisions. And that's why we need to be vigilant and promote action. And in spite of this study, and probably many other studies about this is going to come down the road, some are not going to listen. They're going to repeat the same safety narrative stuff. And we might even have more concerted effort from the police to push themselves into schools with simple reforms to keep justifying their existence.
And there's another question that's very, very tied to that one, which is that after the Winnipeg School Division eliminated the Police in Schools program, the Winnipeg Police Service have continually tried to bring police back, including looking for other funding sources, changing its name, etc. So what can we do to continue to raise awareness on this topic, especially as there will be a large number of new school trustees who may not be aware?
Yeah, this is like it requires a comprehensive strategy, I feel. I think I've seen a recent reference in the literature that refers to the police as a snake always changing skin, using different reform tactics to diversify themselves in a different way to justify their existence. So there's going to be a pushback after and a double down on the safety narrative. There's going to be white families angry with this report, squeaking the squeaking wheel. And so we need the racialized community to help them do the similar work that to do that voice. So yeah, that means more representation in the school system, on the school boards, in the staff, but it could be a choice in curriculum, implementing curriculum that doesn't have policing in it, better history, but promoting those different interactions. There's simple measures at times. If your classroom is concerned about things like sexual consent or drug use, there's many people who are way better to talking to those kids than having a police officer talk there about cracking on crime and don't be scared from my weapon. This is what happens in our school right now. But unfortunately, yeah, it's more than just raising awareness. We really need to raise mobilization and act to make people listen and force the police out of our community, because they're not going to listen to talking and me giving research. Or but it doesn't mean. That's why I also feel the advocacy work of Police-Free Schools Winnipeg and others in Winnipeg and outside is really important in having those conversations. Maybe also helping staff speak up against those issues. Many staff in the school system are very hesitant, and if they speak, they're often they get there's a backlash from the school system against them. So providing a safe space for staff to vocalize those voices and also stand up for others. Maybe it's a long rant, sorry, Jennifer, but it's a lot there. Irene, I don't know if you wanted to add something on the issue of raising awareness. Okay.
Thanks, Fadi. So there is somebody celebrating, the partnership with youth, newcomer youth, and youth in racism, and looking forward to showing those youth this report to inspire their own research. So somebody is wondering whether you'd be interested in talking to youth about this project.
Yeah, they can reach out to me. There's I think I'm at the University of Manitoba right now. You could find it online or contact us in a way.
Yeah, and if
I can have more information and think about it, but thank you.
And folks can reach out to us too to help get connected with Fadi if you have any issues. I am taking a look at the questions coming in. I think there's another one, wondering whether the research included analysis of mental health issues that may be triggered in Indigenous and Black youth, and wondering how those, I guess, are interacting with policing.
It's really important question. I didn't focus specifically on mental health, but it was really hard when I talked to students and listened to them, not to see their own stresses and experiencing that, because it's triggering to go back to your own experiences of harm and racism, being strip searched in a hallway, racial abusing and taunting, and then it goes to your parents and to your experience in the community. So yeah, in many cases I felt, and the way the students expressed it, as a long-term impact on me. It's hard to focus at times. It's anxious driven. Am I doing the right thing? Race scholars talk about this double consciousness a lot in racialized communities, that so then in the presence of a police officer, you have to see yourself as, am I acting right in front of this officer? You can't just be yourself as a child, like an average white or a status quo person who fits the norm. But yeah, I think that deserves an analysis. It's just sometimes the mental health focus is concerning because it individualizes the problem when this is a social harm. And we need to give them resources and look at mental health. But if we're just looking at mental health and not why we have police in schools and all the other systems of harm, we need to address it from a root perspective, I think. But yeah, thank you for this question and being here and listening and supporting the pledge. So I appreciate that.
Thanks, Fadi. Somebody, I think maybe for our last note, somebody reminds us that parents and non-parents alike contribute tax dollars to fund school divisions, and so are all deserving of accountability and voicing their concerns. So however we can do that, we ought to. So I wanted to maybe give a last opportunity, Fadi or Irene, if you had anything else to add before wrapping up. Go ahead.
I just have one last thing about that last comment. So I don't normalize the violence against undocumented people or others who might not contribute to the tax system, but are really good people. And so, yeah, I get the sentiment there that it's a waste of money. And yes, it is. It's a drain on the society. But but again, we shouldn't just think about it as a financial issue. We should think about this as a race, harm, unjustness that demands action, regardless of how expensive it might be. It's usually cheaper to involve other people than the police. Yeah. Thank you, everyone. And Irene, I don't know if you had something else to add. Yeah.
No, but thank you.
Thanks, Irene. Thanks, Fadi. So merci. Thank you, everyone, and in particular to Fadi for this important research, to Irene and Police-Free Schools Winnipeg, to Elizabeth and Dagan, who's also been helping in the back end. I noted also a lot of election hopefuls, both municipal candidates and school trustee candidates here this evening. So thank you for taking the time and taking these recommendations to heart as part of your campaigns. I know we had at least one person pledge in the chat. You may not have seen it, but us back here did. So thank you for being here. For all the guests this evening, thanks for taking the time to be with us, learn about the research findings and committing to support its recommendations in your circles, in your election choices, and in your ongoing work the other days of the year that aren't elections. So hopefully this is equipping us with more information needed to help those most marginalized by the systems of which we are part and of which many of us benefit, again, at the expense of others. So you can find Fadi's research as well as all other work of the Manitoba Research Alliance on the MRA's website, which if I can type quick enough, I will include here. Watch for other kind of important research that's coming out, because there's lots and lots of research coming through the Manitoba Research Alliance, the CCPA, but also all other groups who are producing. And there's so many wonderful election kind of platforms that community organizations are putting forward for people to pledge onto or to take and to move forward with, because there's so much wisdom in the communities. And this research is proof of that. So thanks again, everyone. Have a good evening and take care.